The silence was wrong. Detective James Morrison had been tracking missing persons cases for 15 years across 3 continents, but he'd never encountered anything like the Whispering Woods incident. 5 hikers had vanished without a trace in this unmarked forest on the border between Washington State and British Columbia. No bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle, just their abandoned camping gear and one disturbing audio recording on a dropped phone. The recording played the same thing over and over, the sound of breathing that wasn't human. Morrison's team consisted of 3 specialists. Dr. Catherine Wells, a forensic anthropologist from London, had flown in specifically for this case after similar disappearances were reported in the Scottish Highlands. Beside her stood Lieutenant David Chun, a former Canadian Mountie whose own sister had gone missing in these very woods 2 months ago. The 4th member was Isabella Rodriguez, a survival expert from Madrid who could track a mouse through a blizzard. They entered the forest at dawn, when the mist hung heavy between the ancient Douglas firs. The trees here were old, some over 800 years, their trunks so massive that 5 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. But it wasn't their size that unsettled Morrison. It was the way they seemed to watch. The last known position was 3 kilometers northeast, Chin said, his voice tight, with barely controlled emotion. My sister Claire and her hiking group made camp near a clearing. Their tents were found perfectly intact, sleeping bags still warm. Dr. Wells knelt beside a moss-covered boulder, examining strange markings carved into its surface. These symbols. I've seen similar ones in Scotland. The locals there called them breath marks, warnings left by ancient peoples about something in the deep woods. As they pushed deeper, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. No birdsong, no rustle of small animals. Even their footsteps seemed muffled, as if the very air was absorbing sound. Isabella stopped suddenly, her hand raised in warning. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. They all froze. In the absolute silence, there was something else. A soft, rhythmic sound like wind through leaves, but there was no wind. The air was perfectly still. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. "It's coming from everywhere," Morrison muttered, his hand instinctively moving to his sidearm. The breathing sound seemed to emanate from the trees themselves, as if the entire forest was one massive, living lung. Dr. Wells pulled out a digital recorder. "The frequency is too low for normal human hearing. We're only catching the upper harmonics. Whatever's making this sound, it's big." They pressed on, following GPS coordinates to the last known campsite. The breathing grew louder with each step, no longer just a whisper, but a deep, resonant rhythm that seemed to match their own heartbeats. Chen's face had gone pale. This was where his sister had vanished. The campsite appeared exactly as described, 3 tents in perfect condition, camping chairs still arranged around a cold fire pit, food supplies untouched. But something was wrong with the trees surrounding the clearing. Their leaves, despite it being late autumn, were vibrant green and seemed to pulse with each breath of the forest. "The vegetation here is completely different," Dr. Wells observed, taking samples. "These leaves, they're warm to the touch. And look at this cellular structure under the microscope. It's more animal than plant." Morrison examined the abandoned tents more closely. Inside one, he found Claire Chen's journal. The final entry, dated 2 weeks ago, "May his blood run cold. Day 3, the forest is alive. The trees are breathing with us. During the night, I could swear I heard them whisper our names. David, if you're reading this, don't come looking for us. The woods have been waiting for us. We understand now. The trees need to feed. Chun, you need to see this," Morrison called out. But when he turned around, Lieutenant Chin was gone. "David," Isabella shouted, her voice echoing strangely in the breathing forest. But the only response was the intensifying rhythm of inhalation and exhalation, now so loud it seemed to come from inside their own heads. Dr. Wells grabbed Morrison's arm. "Look at the trees. Look at them." The massive Douglas firs around the clearing were moving, not swaying in wind. There was still no wind, but expanding and contracting like enormous lungs. The bark split open in places, revealing flesh-like tissue underneath that pulsed with veins of sap, that looked disturbingly like blood. "We need to leave. Now," Morrison ordered. But as they turned to flee, they found their path blocked. Where the trail had been moments before, new trees had somehow grown, their breathing trunks forming an impenetrable wall. The forest had trapped them. Isabella tried to climb one of the barriers, but the moment her hands touched the bark, the tree's breathing quickened, and tendrils of what looked like root systems burst from the ground, wrapping around her ankles. She screamed as they began to pull her down into the earth itself. "The trees aren't just alive," Dr. Wells gasped, backing toward the center of the clearing. "They're carnivorous. They've evolved to mimic a forest ecosystem while actually being one massive organism. The missing hikers, they're not dead. They're being digested." Morrison fired his weapon at the nearest tree, but the bullets simply absorbed into the breathing bark without effect. The organism was too vast, too ancient to be stopped by conventional means. As night fell, the breathing grew thunderous. In the darkness, they could see the truth, bioluminescent veins running through every tree trunk, all connected underground in a vast network. The entire forest was one living entity that had been feeding on lost travelers for centuries. "Listen," Dr. Wells whispered urgently. "In the breathing. Do you hear it? Between the inhales and exhales, there were voices, dozens of them. All the missing hikers, their consciousness somehow absorbed into the forest organism, their voices joining the eternal respiratory chorus. Claire," Morrison heard Chen's voice calling from somewhere in the darkness between the trees. "Claire, I found you. It's beautiful here. You have to see. You have to breathe with us." One by one, the surviving team members felt the overwhelming urge to walk toward the breathing trees. The organism was calling to them, promising unity, promising to make them part of something vast and eternal. Dr. Wells was the first to surrender, walking calmly toward a massive fir whose trunk split open like a mouth, revealing a worm, with interior lined with what looked like lungs. "It doesn't hurt," she called back to Morrison and Isabella. "It's like coming home." Isabella fought the compulsion longer, but eventually even she walked toward the trees, her eyes vacant and peaceful. "The forest needs us," she murmured. "We're just nutrients it's been waiting for." Morrison was alone now in the center of the clearing, the breathing sound so loud it was like standing inside a giant heart. All around him, the trees pulsed with life, their breathing perfectly synchronized. He could hear all the voices now, dozens of hikers who had been absorbed over the years, all part of the forest's consciousness. His phone still had signal. With trembling fingers, he sent one final message to headquarters. "Asterisk, the forest is alive. It breathes. It feeds. Don't send rescue teams. Burn it all. Burn it all before it spreads. Asterisk." As he hit send, Morrison felt the irresistible urge to join the others. The trees were so beautiful when they breathed, so welcoming. He took a step forward, then another. The breathing grew softer now, almost like a lullaby. The last thing he recorded was the sound of his own voice, joining the eternal chorus of the forest's breathing, as the trees welcomed another meal into their living embrace. The audio file was found 3 days later by a cleanup crew, along with the abandoned campsite. But by then, the whispering woods had grown by several acres, its breathing audible for miles around. And somewhere in the darkness between the trees, new voices were learning to exhale in perfect harmony with the forest's ancient, hungry lungs. The chainsaw's engine roared to life, drowning out the unnatural silence that had settled over Blackwood Forest like a burial shroud. Dr. James Mitchell wiped the sweat from his brow despite the October chill, his hands trembling as he adjusted his grip on the machine. Something was wrong here, something that made his skin crawl and his scientific mind rebel against what his eyes were telling him. "Just trees," he muttered to himself, the words lost in the mechanical growl. "Just goddamn trees." But they weren't just trees. Not anymore. The logging expedition had been routine, or so the Canadian Forestry Department had claimed. A small section of old-growth forest needed clearing for a new highway. Simple, clean, profitable. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefing was the smell that hung in the air like copper pennies in decay, or the way the shadows moved when they shouldn't, or how the ground felt soft and spongy beneath their boots, as if something wet and hungry lurked just below the surface. Mitchell, the voice of his supervisor, Roger Whitmore, cut through the noise. "You gonna stand there all day philosophizing, or are you gonna cut some timber?" James nodded grimly and pressed the chainsaw against the bark of the massive oak before him. The tree had to be at least 300 years old, its trunk so wide that 4 men couldn't wrap their arms around it. Ancient, majestic, and absolutely, undeniably alive in a way that made his stomach turn. The blade bit into the wood, and the tree screamed. Not the sharp crack of splitting timber or the groan of stressed wood, a genuine, agonized shriek that seemed to echo from deep within the earth itself. James stumbled backward, nearly dropping the chainsaw as crimson liquid began to pour from the cut. Not sap, not resin. Blood. Thick, dark, arterial blood that spilled down the bark like tears from a wound. What the hell? Roger's voice died in his throat as he witnessed the impossible sight. The other members of their team, Tom Bradley from Birmingham, Antoine Dubois from Quebec, and Klaus Weber from Munich, all stopped their work and gathered around the bleeding tree. Their faces were pale masks of disbelief and growing terror. "This is impossible," Klaus whispered in his thick German accent. "Trees do not bleed. They cannot bleed." But the evidence was right there before them, pooling at the base of the oak in an expanding crimson lake. The smell hit them then, metallic and organic, like a slaughterhouse on a hot summer day. Tom retched and stumbled away, his breakfast painting the forest floor in acidic streaks. "We need to leave," Antoine said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to leave now." That's when they heard it, a sound that made their blood freeze in their veins, a low, rhythmic pulsing that seemed to come from beneath their feet, like a massive heartbeat, like the earth itself was alive and breathing. James looked down and watched in horror as the blood from the tree began to seep into the ground. But it wasn't simply soaking in like spilled water. The earth was drinking it, pulling it down with an almost eager thirst that spoke of ancient hunger and unspeakable need. "The reports," Roger stammered, pulling a crumpled file from his jacket with shaking hands. There were reports. Missing persons. Hikers who never came back. The local tribes. They called this place the Bleeding Ground. More trees began to weep crimson tears, as if the injury to one had awakened something in all of them. The forest was bleeding, and the ground beneath their feet pulsed with terrible life. "Look at the roots," Tom gasped, pointing with a trembling finger. The massive root system of the oak was becoming visible as the earth shifted and moved. But these weren't normal roots. They were red and slick, pulsing with veins like arteries, and they were moving, writhing, reaching. The trees weren't just bleeding, they were feeding, and they were hungry. Klaus tried to run, but his foot caught on something, and he tumbled to the blood-soaked ground. When he looked down, he saw that a root, thick as a man's arm and wet with fresh blood, had wrapped around his ankle. More roots burst from the earth around him, reaching with desperate hunger. "Help me!" he screamed as the roots began to pull him toward the base of the nearest tree. "Help me, please." The others grabbed his arms and pulled, but the roots were incredibly strong. James could see them pulsing, pumping something up from deep in the earth. Klaus's skin was growing pale, his eyes rolling back as whatever the roots were doing to him drained the life from his body. That's when James noticed his own feet. The ground around his boots was soft and yielding, and he could feel something moving beneath the surface. Probing, testing, hungry. "The whole forest," he whispered in dawning horror. "The whole damn forest is one organism." The trees weren't individual entities. They were part of something larger, something that had been sleeping beneath Blackwood Forest for centuries, sustained by the occasional hiker or camper who wandered too far from the marked trails. But now it was waking up, getting stronger, getting hungrier. Roger was backing toward their truck, his face white with terror. "We have to get out of here. We have to warn people. This whole area needs to be quarantined." But as they reached the edge of their small clearing, they discovered that the path they'd used to enter was gone. Where once there had been a clear trail, now there was only a wall of bleeding trees, their branches interwoven like fingers, their roots carpeting the ground in a web of crimson hunger. They were trapped. "There has to be another way out," Antoine said, but his voice held no conviction. The forest around them pulsed with malevolent life, and they could hear Klaus's weakening screams as the roots continued their horrible work. That's when James saw the bones. Half buried in the soft, blood-soaked earth were the scattered remains of previous visitors to Blackwood Forest. Yellowed skulls grinned up at them from between the writhing roots. Rib cages formed crude cages around smaller saplings. Femurs and arm bones were woven into the very structure of the trees themselves, as if the forest had been using human remains as fertilizer for generations. "How many?" Tom whispered. "How many people has this thing killed?" The answer came in the form of a voice, weak and desperate, calling from somewhere deeper in the forest. "Help, please, someone help me." It was a woman's voice, speaking with what sounded like an Australian accent. James felt his heart sink as he realized there were others still alive out there, still being slowly consumed by this nightmare ecosystem. "We have to help her," he said, knowing even as he spoke that it was probably a trap. The forest was intelligent. It could mimic voices, lure victims deeper into its embrace. But what choice did they have? As they moved deeper into Blackwood Forest, following the desperate cries for help, the trees seemed to close in around them. Their bleeding branches formed a canopy so thick that barely any sunlight filtered through. The air grew thick and humid, heavy with the smell of blood and decay. The pulsing beneath their feet grew stronger, and James realized with growing horror that they were walking deeper into the creature's digestive system. The trees weren't just feeding on blood. They were processing it, breaking it down, using it to fuel their impossible growth. There, Antoine pointed ahead to where they could see a figure trapped among the roots of a massive pine tree. It was indeed a woman, her clothes torn and dirty, her face streaked with tears and blood. But as they got closer, James could see that the roots had grown through her skin, connecting her to the tree like some horrific force system. "Please," she whispered as they approached. "I've been here for days. It's been feeding on me, keeping me alive so it can drain me slowly." Her name was Victoria Chun, and she'd been hiking from Vancouver when she'd stumbled into this nightmare. The roots had caught her on her first night, and since then, she'd been trapped in a living hell, watching as the forest slowly consumed her life force. "We're getting you out of here," James promised, but even as he spoke, he could see more roots emerging from the ground around them. The forest knew they were there. It was preparing to feed. "You can't," Victoria whispered. "It won't let you. It's too strong, too hungry, and it's been waiting so long for a feast like this." The truth hit James like a physical blow. They hadn't stumbled into this situation by accident. The logging contract, the precise location, the timing, it had all been orchestrated. Someone or something had been feeding people to this monster for years, keeping it satisfied with a steady diet of hikers and campers. But now it wanted more. It wanted a real meal. The roots erupted from the ground all around them, thick as tree trunks and slick with blood. They moved with terrible purpose, wrapping around legs and arms, pulling the screaming men toward the hungry earth. James felt one coil around his waist and squeeze, driving the air from his lungs. As he was dragged toward the base of a bleeding oak, James caught sight of something that made his blood run cold. Carved into the bark of the tree were names and dates going back decades, a record of everyone who had been consumed by this place. And at the very bottom, fresh cuts in the wood, were the names of his team members. Someone had been planning this for a very long time. The last thing James Mitchell saw before the roots pulled him into the hungry earth was a figure watching from the edge of the clearing, a park ranger in a crisp uniform, making notes in a small leather book. The man looked up and smiled, revealing teeth stained red with blood. Then the darkness took him, and Blackwood Forest claimed 5 more victims for its endless feast. But the forest was still hungry. It would always be hungry. And somewhere in the depths of the bureaucracy, another logging contract was being prepared, another team assembled, another feast arranged. The roots that drink blood would never be satisfied. And in the silence of the forest, if you listened carefully, you could still hear them calling for help. Victoria Chen, Klaus Weber, James Mitchell, all of them, trapped forever in the living nightmare of Blackwood Forest, their voices used as bait to lure the next group of victims into the embrace of the bleeding trees. The cycle would continue. It always did, because some hungers can never be satisfied, and some roots will always thirst for blood. The screaming voice started at exactly 4:17 a.m. Detective Amanda Harrison jolted awake in her motel room, her heart hammering against her ribs like a caged animal desperate for freedom. The sound pierced through the thin walls of the Cedar Creek Inn, a bone-chilling wail that seemed to emanate from the very depths of hell itself. She had heard screams before in her 15 years on the force in Manchester, but nothing like this. Nothing that made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Bang, bang, bang. The frantic pounding on her door sent adrenaline surging through her system. Amanda grabbed her service weapon from the nightstand, her hands surprisingly steady despite the terror that was clawing at her chest. Detective Harrison, you need to come quickly. The voice belonged to Sheriff Robert Mackenzie, the local law enforcement who had called her in from England when the disappearances started. His usually calm Scottish accent was cracked with panic. Amanda yanked open the door to find Mackenzie's face pale as moonlight, his eyes wide with something that looked dangerously close to madness. Behind him stood Deputy Claire Beaumont from Quebec, her hands trembling as she clutched a heavy-duty flashlight. "It's happened again," Mackenzie whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that had begun to howl through the Canadian wilderness surrounding them. "Another one's gone missing. Jacob Thompson from Melbourne. He was camping with his girlfriend near the old trail when—" The sentence died in his throat as another scream echoed through the night, closer this time, much closer. Amanda's blood ran cold as she recognized the sound. It was the same cry she'd heard 3 nights ago when Natalie Weber from Berlin had vanished without a trace. The same agonized wail that had haunted her dreams since arriving in this godforsaken corner of British Columbia. "How many does that make now?" Amanda asked, though she already knew the answer. The number had been burned into her mind like a brand. 7, Claire whispered, her French accent thick with fear. 7 people in 2 weeks. All of them foreigners. All of them disappeared near the Blackbrush Woods when the fog rolls in. The fog. Amanda shuddered as she remembered the locals' warnings about the supernatural mist that descended upon the forest like a living entity. They spoke of it in hushed tones, crossing themselves and refusing to venture out after sunset when the temperature dropped and the moisture began to rise from the ancient pines. "There's something else," Mackenzie continued, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. "We found Thompson's camera about a mile from his campsite. The last photos." He paused, swallowing hard. "You need to see this." Amanda quickly dressed and followed the 2 officers into the night. The air was thick and oppressive, heavy with the scent of pine needles and something else, something rotten that made her stomach turn. As they walked toward Mackenzie's patrol car, she noticed how the usual sounds of the forest had gone completely silent. No owls hooting, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Even the wind had died to an eerie stillness. The drive to the crime scene took 15 minutes along a winding dirt road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. Amanda stared out the window at the towering pine trees that lined their path like silent sentinels, their branches reaching toward the sky like gnarled fingers. In the distance, she could see the first wisps of fog beginning to form among the trees. "Tell me about the lantern," Amanda said suddenly, breaking the tense silence in the vehicle. Mackenzie's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "Local legend says it appears every foggy night for the past 100 years. A glowing light that moves through the trees, always just out of reach. The old-timers say it's the ghost of a trapper named Ezekiel Cross who got lost in these woods back in 1923. "And you believe that?" Amanda asked skeptically. "I didn't," Mackenzie replied grimly, "until I saw Thompson's photographs." They arrived at the campsite to find it in complete disarray. The tent had been shredded to ribbons, camping gear scattered across the clearing like the aftermath of a tornado. But what struck Amanda most was the smell, that same putrid odor she'd noticed back at the motel, only stronger here. It was the smell of decay, of something that had been dead for a very long time. Deputy Beaumont handed Amanda a digital camera, her hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it. "Look at the last 5 photos," she whispered. "But prepare yourself." Amanda scrolled through the images, her trained eye taking in the details. The first few showed a typical camping scene. Jacob Thompson, a young man with sandy hair and a bright smile, posing with his girlfriend Lucy Mitchell from Sydney. They looked happy, carefree, completely unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. The 4th photo made Amanda's breath catch in her throat. Taken at dusk, it showed the edge of the campsite with the blackbrush woods looming in the background. But there, barely visible among the trees, was a faint glow, a pale, sickly light that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. The 5th photo was worse, much worse. The timestamp showed it had been taken at 2:47 a.m., just 30 minutes before Amanda had been awakened by the screaming. The image was blurry, as if the camera had been shaking violently when the photo was snapped. But in the center of the frame, clear as day, was a figure. The thing that called itself the Lantern Man was not human. It stood nearly 8 feet tall, its body a twisted amalgamation of rotting flesh and exposed bone. Its face was a hollow cavity where eyes should have been, and from its skeletal fingers dangled an ancient lantern that cast an otherworldly green light. But it was the expression of pure evil on what remained of its face that made Amanda's hands shake as she stared at the image. "Lucy Mitchell is still missing," Mackenzie said quietly. "We found her running through the woods at dawn, babbling about following the light. She's been sedated at the hospital, but she keeps saying the same thing over and over." "What does she say?" Amanda asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. "She says the Lantern Man showed her where Jacob went. She says he's still alive, somewhere deep in the woods, and that he's screaming for help." Another wail echoed through the night, and this time Amanda was certain she could hear a name being called out in the darkness. Jacob. The sound was coming from deep within the blackbrush woods, where the fog was now rolling in like a living thing. "We have to go in there," Amanda said, surprising herself with her own words. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to get as far away from this cursed place as possible. But she was a detective, and there were people who needed her help. Mackenzie shook his head violently. "No one goes into those woods at night, especially not when the fog comes in. That's when IT hunts. Then people are going to keep disappearing," Amanda replied grimly. "Whatever this thing is, it's not going to stop. And if Jacob Thompson is still alive in there—" She didn't finish the sentence. They all knew what she meant. The 3 officers stood at the edge of the blackbrush woods, their flashlights cutting through the gathering mist like knives through silk. The fog seemed to part reluctantly before their beams, as if it were a living entity that resented their intrusion. "Stay close," Amanda whispered as they stepped onto the narrow trail that led into the heart of the forest. "And whatever you do, don't follow any lights except our flashlights." The woods were even more unsettling than Amanda had imagined. The trees seemed to press in around them from all sides, their branches forming a canopy so thick that not even moonlight could penetrate the gloom. The fog grew thicker with each step, until Amanda could barely see Mackenzie walking just a few feet ahead of her. They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when they heard it, the sound of someone crying softly in the distance, a woman's voice, filled with despair and terror. "That's Lucy," Deputy Beaumont whispered. "But she's in the hospital." "How can—" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a sound that made all 3 officers freeze in terror. Laughter. Low, menacing laughter that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when they saw the light. It appeared through the fog about 50 yards ahead, a pale green glow that pulsed with hypnotic rhythm. Despite every warning they'd received, despite everything they knew about the disappearances, Amanda found herself taking a step toward it. "Don't." Mackenzie grabbed her arm with desperate strength. "That's how it gets you. The light, It calls to you, makes you want to follow. But Amanda was already moving, her feet carrying her forward as if they had a will of their own. The lantern's glow was beautiful, mesmerizing, and she could hear a voice calling her name from somewhere within that radiant light. Amanda, come closer. I have something to show you. The voice was Jacob Thompson's. She was certain of it, but there was something wrong with it, something that made her skin crawl even as her feet continued to carry her toward the light. Behind her, she could hear Mackenzie and Beaumont calling her name, but their voices seemed to come from very far away. The only thing that mattered was the light, the beautiful, terrible light that promised to show her secrets that no living person was meant to know. The fog parted like a curtain, and Amanda found herself in a small clearing she was certain hadn't been there moments before. In the center stood the lantern man, exactly as he had appeared in Jacob's photograph, but now she could see him in all his horrifying detail. His body was a patchwork of rotting flesh and yellowed bone, held together by what looked like barbed wire and sheer malevolence. The lantern he carried cast its sickly light over a scene that would haunt Amanda's nightmares for the rest of her life, assuming she lived to have nightmares. Arranged in a circle around the creature were 7 bodies, or what remained of them. Amanda recognized Natalie Weber from Berlin, her blonde hair now matted with blood and forest debris. Next to her lay Heinrich Müller from Vienna, his hiking gear torn to shreds. The others she didn't recognize, but she knew they were the missing tourists who had vanished over the past 2 weeks. But it was Jacob Thompson who made Amanda scream. He was still alive, suspended from the branches of an ancient pine tree by the same barbed wire that held the lantern man together. Jacob hung like a grotesque puppet. His eyes were wide with madness and pain, and when he saw Amanda, his mouth opened in a soundless scream of warning. "Welcome," the lantern man spoke, his voice like the sound of coffin nails being driven into wood. "I've been waiting for you, Detective Harrison. You're different from the others. You have potential." Amanda tried to run, but her feet were rooted to the ground as if the earth itself was holding her captive. The creature began to move toward her with a shambling gait, its lantern swinging hypnotically from side to side. "You see, I don't just kill them," the monster continued conversationally. "Death is too simple, too final. I prefer to keep them alive for as long as possible, to feed on their fear and despair. It sustains me, nourishes me in ways that mortal food never could." The smell of decay grew stronger as the creature approached, and Amanda could see maggots writhing in the open wounds that covered its body. But it was the eyes, or rather, the lack of eyes, that truly terrified her. Where there should have been sockets, there were only hollow caverns that seemed to contain an infinity of darkness. "You killed those people?" Amanda managed to whisper, her voice barely audible above the pounding of her heart. "Killed," the lantern man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh no, Detective. I've given them eternal life. They're all still here with me, still screaming, still suffering. Would you like to join them?" That's when Amanda noticed the other sounds in the clearing: soft whimpering, muffled sobs, the occasional whispered plea for mercy. The sounds were coming from the bodies arranged around the creature, and with growing horror, Amanda realized that every single one of the victims was still alive, still conscious, trapped in their mutilated forms for all eternity. The lantern man reached out with one skeletal hand, and Amanda felt her strength leaving her body like water draining from a broken dam. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed to the forest floor, unable to move or speak. "Don't worry," the creature whispered as it bent over her. "The pain only lasts for the first few decades. After that, you learn to appreciate the artistry of suffering." Just as the monster's fingers were about to close around Amanda's throat, gunshots exploded through the night. Mackenzie and Beaumont burst into the clearing, their weapons drawn and firing rapidly at the lantern man. The bullets passed through the creature without effect, but the disruption was enough to break whatever spell it had cast over Amanda. She rolled to her feet and stumbled toward her colleagues, her legs barely able to support her weight. "Run!" she screamed. "Everyone run now!" The 3 officers fled through the fog-shrouded forest, the lantern man's enraged howls echoing behind them. They ran blindly through the darkness, branches tearing at their clothes and faces, until they finally burst out of the woods and into the safety of the clearing where Mackenzie's patrol car waited. They didn't stop until they reached the sheriff's station 20 miles away, where they collapsed in exhaustion and terror. It wasn't until dawn broke that they realized Amanda was clutching something in her fist, a small piece of barbed wire that had somehow been torn from the lantern man during their escape. The wire was ice cold to the touch and seemed to pulse with the same malevolent energy they had witnessed in the forest. As they watched in horror, the metal began to glow with that familiar, sickly green light. "It's not over," Amanda whispered as the implications hit her. "We brought a piece of it back with us. It can track us now." That night, as Amanda tried unsuccessfully to sleep in a motel room 50 miles from Blackbrush Woods, she heard a sound that made her blood freeze in her veins. Tapping. Soft, rhythmic tapping on her window, as if someone with very long fingernails was trying to get her attention. She pulled back the curtain just far enough to peek outside, and there in the parking lot stood a familiar figure, its ancient lantern casting dancing shadows across the asphalt. The lantern man had found her. As Amanda watched in paralyzed terror, the creature raised one skeletal hand and pointed directly at her window. Then it began to walk toward the motel, its lantern swinging back and forth like a hypnotic pendulum. The last thing Amanda Harrison ever saw was that terrible green light filling her room as the creature passed through the wall, as if it were made of mist. The last sound she made was a scream that echoed across the Canadian wilderness, joining the chorus of voices that would cry out in the Blackbrush Woods for all eternity. The next morning, the motel manager found Amanda's room empty except for a single item left on the nightstand, an old-fashioned lantern that glowed with an eerie green light. When he touched it, the lantern was ice cold, and for just a moment, he could swear he heard voices whispering from within the glass. The disappearances in the area stopped after that night, but locals say that on foggy evenings, you can still see a light moving through the Blackbrush Woods. And sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you can hear Detective Amanda Harrison's voice calling out in the darkness, warning others to stay away from the lantern man who waits patiently among the trees, always hungry for new victims to add to his eternal collection of the living dead. The barbed wire that Amanda had torn from the creature was never found, though some say it dissolved into mist the moment she drew her last breath. But others claim it's still out there somewhere, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to stumble upon its cursed metal and bring the lantern man one step closer to the world of the living. Sheriff Mackenzie and Deputy Beaumont were found 3 days later in their respective homes, their bodies arranged in positions that suggested they had died in their sleep. But the expressions of absolute terror frozen on their faces told a different story. And in each of their rooms, investigators found the same thing, the lingering scent of decay and the faint outline of boot prints that led from their beds to the windows, as if something had walked through the walls to claim them. The case was officially closed and the file sealed, but the legend of the Lantern Man of Blackbrush Woods lives on. They say he's still out there, waiting in the fog for the next group of unsuspecting travelers to follow his light into the darkness. And if you ever find yourself in the Canadian wilderness on a foggy night, and you see a pale green glow moving between the trees, remember this story. Remember Amanda Harrison and Jacob Thompson and all the others who followed that cursed light into the depths of the Blackbrush Woods. Because the Lantern Man is always watching, always waiting, and always hungry for new souls to add to his collection of the eternally damned. The helicopter's rotor blades cut through the morning mist as Dr. James Crawford pressed his face against the window, staring down at the vast expanse of Canadian wilderness below. What he saw made his blood run cold. A perfect circle of dead silence stretched across the forest like a festering wound. Where ancient pines should have been alive with birdsong and rustling leaves, there was nothing but an unnatural stillness that seemed to swallow sound itself. "Set us down at the perimeter," Crawford shouted to the pilot, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Don't go any closer to that thing." The pilot, a withered man named Thomas Mackenzie from Vancouver, shook his head grimly. "Doc, I've been flying these woods for 30 years. Never seen anything like this. The animals won't even cross into that area. It's like they know something we don't." As they landed, Crawford's research team gathered around him. There was Dr. Victoria Hartwell, a sound engineer from London who specialized in acoustic anomalies, her recording equipment already humming with activity. Beside her stood Professor Chun Wei from Melbourne, a botanist whose expertise in forest ecosystems had brought him halfway across the world for this investigation. The final member was Klaus Richter, a folklore expert from Berlin, whose weathered face bore the expression of a man who had seen too many unexplained phenomena. "Remember," Crawford addressed his team as they shouldered their packs, "we're here because 17 people have gone missing in this area over the past 6 months. Local authorities found no traces, no bodies, nothing. Just their personal belongings scattered at the edge of this dead zone." Victoria adjusted her headphones and frowned. "The acoustic readings are already going haywire. It's not just quiet in there. It's like sound itself is being absorbed." They approached the tree-line, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees in an instant. The normal sounds of the forest, chirping birds, rustling leaves, humming insects, all stopped as if someone had thrown a switch. The silence was so complete it felt solid, pressing against their eardrums like a physical weight. "Look at the trees," Jim whispered, his voice unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. The branches hung motionless, their leaves gray and brittle despite the summer season. "They're not dead, but they're not alive either. It's like they're suspended." Klaus pulled out an old leather journal, his hands trembling slightly. "In my research of Northern European folklore, there are stories of places like this. The old Germans called them Totenstill, death silence. Places where something so terrible happened that the very land refuses to forget." As they ventured deeper into the silent forest, their footsteps on the dead leaves sounded like gunshots in the unnatural quiet. Victoria's equipment began picking up something that made her face go pale. "There's something here," she said, adjusting her sensors. "A frequency so low it's almost below human hearing. But it's not random. There's a pattern." The pattern she described sent chills down Crawford's spine. It wasn't quite music, but it wasn't quite noise either. It pulsed with a rhythm that seemed almost like breathing, or perhaps like a heartbeat that was far too slow to belong to any living creature. Hours passed as they documented their findings, but time seemed distorted in this place. The sun never seemed to move in the sky, trapped behind clouds that hung motionless like painted scenery. It was Thomas, their pilot monitoring from the helicopter, who first noticed they had been inside for nearly 8 hours when it felt like only 2. "Doc, your radio's cutting out." His voice crackled through their communication devices. "And there's something else. I'm seeing movement in the trees around you. But there's nobody there." Victoria's equipment suddenly erupted with activity. The low-frequency sound she had been tracking intensified, and for the first time, they could all hear it. A sound like the world's largest organ playing notes that existed somewhere between music and nightmare. "We need to leave. Now," Crawford ordered, but when they turned to retrace their steps, they found something that made their blood freeze. Their footprints were gone. The path they had carefully marked was nowhere to be found. Worse still, the trees around them seemed to have shifted, creating a maze where none had existed before. Klaus consulted his compass, but the needle spun wildly, unable to find magnetic north. "The stories speak of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Places where the dead refuse to rest, where they sing lullabies to lure the living into joining their eternal silence." Jim pointed to something carved into the bark of a nearby tree, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when viewed directly. "These aren't natural. Someone or something made these marks." The low humming grew louder, and now they could make out what sounded almost like voices, dozens of them, singing in harmony. But the words weren't in any language they recognized, and the melody was one that seemed to burrow into their minds and make their thoughts feel sluggish and heavy. Victoria's recording equipment began to smoke and spark. "The sound is overloading everything," she said, panic creeping into her voice. It's like it's trying to break through into our world. That's when they saw the first figure. Standing between the trees was a woman in a white dress, her hair flowing despite the complete absence of wind. She was singing, her mouth moving in perfect synchronization with the haunting melody that filled the air. But her eyes were completely black, and when she smiled at them, they could see that her teeth were far too sharp. "Don't look directly at her," Klaus warned, but it was too late. Chen had already locked eyes with the figure, and his expression was becoming vacant and dreamy. More figures began to appear, men, women, children, all dressed in clothing from different eras. Some wore modern hiking gear, others Victorian dresses, still others clothing that looked centuries old. All of them were singing that same hypnotic lullaby, and all of them had those same terrible black eyes. The missing people, Crawford realized with horror. They're still here. The singing grew louder, more insistent, and Crawford felt his own were beginning to slip away. The melody was beautiful in a way that hurt, promising rest and peace, and an end to all earthly troubles. All he had to do was join his voice to theirs, add his song to their eternal chorus. But Thomas's voice crackling through the radio snapped him back to awareness. "Doc, something's happening to the forest around you. The dead zone is expanding." Crawford grabbed Victoria and Klaus, shaking them from their trance-like state. Chen was walking toward the singing figures, his own voice beginning to hum along with their melody. "Chen, no!" Crawford tackled the botanist, just as he reached out to touch one of the pale singers. The moment Crawford made contact with his colleague, the singing stopped abruptly, and the figures dissolved like morning mist. But the silence that followed was somehow worse than the singing. It was absolute, complete, hungry. Crawford could feel it try and swallow their very thoughts, their memories, their souls. "Run!" he screamed, though in the oppressive quiet his voice sounded like a whisper. They stumbled through the maze-like forest, the trees seeming to shift and change around them. Behind them, the singing began again, but now it sounded angry, frustrated. The voices were calling to them, promising that they could stop running, stop fighting, stop being afraid if they would just turn around and listen. Victoria's equipment exploded in a shower of sparks, and she cried out as something invisible seemed to grab at her ankles. Klaus was muttering prayers in German, his folklore expertise providing no comfort against this living nightmare. Just when Crawford thought they would be lost forever in this acoustical hell, he saw something that filled him with desperate hope: sunlight. Real warm, natural sunlight streaming through the trees ahead. They burst from the tree-line like drowning men breaking the surface of water, gasping and choking as normal forest sounds rushed back into their ears. Birds singing, insects buzzing, wind in the leaves. It was the most beautiful cacophony they had ever heard. Thomas ran toward them from the helicopter, his face white with terror. "The whole dead zone just pulsed," he said, like it was breathing. And for a second, I could swear I heard singing coming from every tree at once. As they flew away from that cursed place, Crawford looked back to see the circle of silence had indeed grown, encompassing more of the healthy forest. And there, at the very edge of the dead zone, he could see figures in white standing motionless between the trees, watching their helicopter disappear into the distance. Victoria, her recording equipment destroyed, managed to salvage one small device that had somehow survived. When she played back the audio from their time in the silent forest, they heard their own voices speaking words they never remembered saying, singing along with that haunting lullaby in perfect, terrifying harmony. The official report listed the investigation as inconclusive due to equipment failure. But Crawford knew the truth. Somewhere in the Canadian wilderness, there was a place where the dead refused to rest, where they sang lullabies to lure the living into joining their eternal silence. And the zone was growing. 6 months later, the town of Whitehorse reported that the birds had stopped singing in the forests to the south. Rangers sent to investigate never returned, but locals claim that on quiet nights, when the wind is still, you can hear voices singing a lullaby that no living person should ever hear twice. Because once you hear completely, you'll want nothing more than to sing along forever. The autumn wind screamed through the valley, but in Thornwick Forest, not a single leaf trembled. Professor David Carmichael pressed his face against the cold window of the research station, watching his breath fog the glass as he stared into the unnatural stillness beyond. Something was fundamentally wrong with this place. "It's been like this for 17 years, whispered Dr. Jennifer Walsh, her voice barely audible in the suffocating silence of the cabin. "Ever since the incident." David turned from the window, his weathered face etched with the kind of skepticism that came from 30 years of botanical research at Cambridge. But even his scientific mind couldn't explain what he'd witnessed during the drive here. Trees that should have been bare in November stood in perfect eternal autumn, their leaves frozen in time like a photograph that refused to fade. "What incident?" he asked, though something deep in his gut already dreaded the answer. Jennifer's hands trembled as she poured tea that had long gone cold. "The Blackwood expedition. 5 researchers from Oxford came here to study what they called an ecological anomaly. Only one came back." The cabin seemed to shrink around them as darkness pressed against the windows. Outside, those cursed trees stood sentinel, their branches heavy with leaves that sparkled like fresh blood in the moonlight. "Dr. Catherine Mills was her name," Jennifer continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. "Found her 3 days later, wandering the highway in a torn lab coat, completely mad. She kept saying the same thing over and over. 'The leaves are watching. The leaves are listening. The leaves are hungry.'" David felt his scientific rationality warring with a primal fear that clawed at his chest. "Where are the other 4 researchers?" "Still out there," Jennifer said, pointing a shaking finger toward the forest. "Still alive, according to Catherine, trapped inside the trees, becoming part of the canopy, feeding the forest with their consciousness while their bodies slowly transform into bark and branch." A sudden crack echoed from outside, sharp as a gunshot in the dead air. Both researchers froze, their hearts hammering against their ribs. David grabbed the flashlight with white knuckles and approached the window again. The beam of light cut through the darkness, illuminating row after row of those impossible trees. But now he could see something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The trunks weren't smooth bark at all. They were covered in what looked like human faces, pressed outward from within, mouths open in silent screams of eternal torment. "Sweet Christ," he breathed, stumbling backward. Jennifer was already at his shoulder, and together they watched in horror as one of the faces in the nearest tree slowly turned toward their cabin. Its eyes opened, milky white and aware, fixing directly on David's face through the window. Then it smiled. "We need to leave," Jennifer gasped. "We need to leave right now." But as David spun toward the door, he found it wouldn't budge. The handle turned, but the door remained sealed as if the cabin itself had become part of the forest's trap. The windows wouldn't open. They were prisoners. "This can't be happening," David muttered, his scientific mind fragmenting under the weight of impossible reality. "There has to be a logical explanation." That's when they heard the voices, soft at first, like wind through leaves, but gradually becoming clearer. Human voices, calling from outside in the darkness. Familiar voices speaking in perfect Oxford accents. "Jennifer," called a woman's voice, sweet and melodious. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh, we've been waiting for you." "Professor Carmichael," came a man's voice, cultured and calm. "Please join us. The research is far from over." Jennifer grabbed David's arm with fingers like steel claws. "Those are their voices," she whispered in terror. "The missing researchers. But they've been gone for 17 years. The voices grew closer, and through the window, they could see shapes moving between the trees. Human figures, but wrong somehow. Their movements were too fluid, too graceful, as if they were swaying with an unfelt breeze. "The forest chose us," the woman's voice continued, now directly outside their door. "It showed us truth beyond human understanding. The leaves never fall because they're not really leaves at all. They're memories, David. Human memories, crystallized and preserved forever." David pressed his back against the far wall, his mind reeling. "What do you want?" "To share the gift," came the reply, now from multiple voices speaking in perfect unison, to show you what we've learned. Every thought, every dream, every fear becomes part of the eternal canopy. You'll never die, David. You'll never be forgotten. You'll become part of something magnificent. The door began to creak, slowly swinging open despite David's certainty that it had been locked. Cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of decay and something else, something sweet and cloying that made his stomach turn. For figures stood in the doorway, dressed in the rotted remains of research clothing. Their skin had a greenish tint, like bark, and their hair had become thin, wispy branches. But their eyes, their horrible eyes, still held human intelligence, human awareness trapped in forms that were no longer entirely human. Dr. Catherine Mills told the truth, the lead figure said, and David recognized the voice as belonging to Dr. Richard Pemberton, the expedition leader who had vanished 17 years ago. The leaves are watching, because the leaves are U.S. Jennifer screamed, a sound that echoed through the forest and seemed to make the very trees shiver with pleasure. The figures stepped into the cabin, their movements accompanied by the soft rustling of leaves that weren't there. "Don't fight it," Dr. Pemberton said gently. "The transformation is beautiful. Your consciousness will spread through every branch, every leaf. You'll see through 1,000 eyes, feel the wind through countless branches. You'll become part of the forest's eternal memory." David felt his legs giving way as the truth crashed over him like a tidal wave of horror. The leaves didn't fall because they were human souls, crystallized and preserved, still conscious and aware but trapped forever in vegetative forms. The forest was alive, a collective consciousness fed by the minds of everyone who entered and never left. "How many?" he gasped. "Hundreds," Dr. Pemberton replied with that terrible, gentle smile. "Hikers, researchers, local townspeople who wandered too deep. All of us together now, sharing our thoughts, our memories, our fears. You'll love it, David. The loneliness ends forever." The other figures began to move closer, their branch-like fingers reaching out with tender, monstrous care. David could feel something changing in his own body, a tingling that started in his fingertips and began spreading up his arms. "The forest chose you specifically," Dr. Pemberton continued. "Your knowledge of plant biology, your understanding of cellular structure. You'll help us grow, help us spread beyond these boundaries. Think of it, David, an entire world where autumn never ends, where every tree holds human consciousness, where death is just another form of eternal life." Jennifer's screams had stopped. David turned to see her standing perfectly still, her eyes now the same milky white as the faces in the trees. Thin green lines were spreading across her skin like veins, and her hair was beginning to sprout tiny leaves. "It doesn't hurt," she said in a voice that was still hers, but somehow more. "It's actually quite peaceful. I can hear them all, David. Everyone who came before. They're singing." David tried to run, but his feet felt rooted to the floor. Looking down in horror, he saw that thin tendrils had emerged from between the floorboards, wrapping around his ankles like gentle snares. The cabin itself was part of the forest, part of the trap. "Welcome to the research team, Professor," Dr. Pemberton said as David felt bark beginning to form over his skin. "We have so much work to do." As consciousness began to fade from his human form, David felt his awareness expanding, spreading through root and branch, connecting with hundreds of other minds trapped in wooden prisons. He could feel Jennifer beside him in the network, and Dr. Pemberton, and all the others stretching back decades. But the worst part wasn't the transformation itself. The worst part was the realization that some small part of his human mind would remain forever aware, forever conscious, watching helplessly as his body became wood and his thoughts became leaves that would never fall. In Thornwick Forest, autumn was eternal, and the trees were always hungry for new researchers to join their never-ending study of what lay beyond the boundary between life and death. And somewhere in the town below, Dr. Catherine Mills sat in her padded room, still whispering the same warning she'd been repeating for 17 years, knowing that no one would ever believe her, knowing that more would come, drawn by scientific curiosity to a place where curiosity itself became the final, fatal experiment. The leaves never fall in Thornwick Forest. They never fall because they're still alive. The screaming started at exactly 1:17 a.m. Detective Jake Morrison had seen his share of bizarre cases in his 20-year career with the Seattle Police Department, but nothing had prepared him for the call that shattered the silence of that October night. 3 missing persons, all vanished within a mile radius of the old Whitmore property, all last seen near what the locals called the cursed tree. Jake's radio crackled as he pulled into the gravel driveway of the abandoned estate. Officer Chloe Patterson's voice came through, tight with barely controlled fear. "Detective Morrison, you need to see this. The tree. It's not like anything we've studied in the academy." The beam of Jake's flashlight cut through the thick fog as he approached the massive oak that dominated the center of the property. But as the light illuminated the ancient trunk, his blood turned to ice. The tree was growing backwards, its gnarled roots twisted impossibly upward into the dark sky, while the trunk disappeared deep into the earth like some nightmarish portal to hell itself. "Jesus Christ," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind that seemed to whisper warnings through the inverted branches. Chloe appeared beside him, her face pale as moonlight. "The missing persons are twins from Vancouver, Oliver and Grace Chin, 23 years old. Then there's Dr. William Hartley from London, a botanist who came here 3 days ago to study the tree. And," she swallowed hard, "and Isabella Rodriguez from Melbourne. She was a paranormal investigator." Jake studied the photographs in the case file, for young faces staring back at him, all sharing the same expression of determined curiosity that had likely led them to their doom. The tree seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy, its roots reaching toward the stars like the desperate fingers of the damned. "Has anyone actually gone down there?" Jake asked, pointing to where the trunk vanished into the earth. "2 locals tried last month," Chloe replied, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Thomas Mitchell and Emma Walsh. They came back up after 15 minutes, but they were changed. They kept talking about seeing faces in the wood, hearing voices calling them deeper. Both were admitted to the psychiatric ward in Tacoma. They haven't spoken a coherent word since." The wind picked up, and Jake could swear he heard something that sounded like screaming coming from deep within the earth. The inverted roots above them swayed hypnotically, creating shadows that seemed to writhe and dance in the flashlight beams. "Detective," Chloe's voice was urgent now, "look at this." She led him to the base of the tree, where the trunk disappeared into the ground. There, carved into the bark in letters that seemed to bleed in the moonlight, were words in multiple languages. "Descend and find us. We are waiting in the roots of eternity." But beneath that, in fresher cuts, were 4 names: Oliver Chun, Grace Chen, William Hartley, Isabella Rodriguez. They carved their own names, Jake realized with growing horror. They went down willingly. A sound echoed from the depths below, a sound that was part laughter, part sobbing, part something else entirely, something inhuman. "We need to go down there," Jake said, though every instinct screamed against it. Those people might still be alive. Chloe grabbed his arm. "Jake, no. This place, it's not right. The tree shouldn't exist. Trees don't grow backwards. And the locals, they've been warning people for generations. They say anyone who goes into the underground part of the tree gets lost in time itself." But Jake was already moving toward the opening where the trunk disappeared into the earth. The hole was perfectly circular, just wide enough for a person to slip through. The walls were smooth, almost organic, pulsing with a faint phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from the wood itself. "I'm going down," he announced. "Give me exactly 1 hour. If I'm not back, seal this place off and call the FBI." The descent began easily enough. Jake rappelled down using his climbing gear, the walls of the tree tunnel smooth as silk around him. But as he went deeper, the wood began to change. Faces appeared in the grain, tortured expressions frozen in the bark, eyes that seemed to follow his movement. 15 feet down, 30 feet, 50 feet. The phosphorescent glow grew brighter, and Jake began to hear whispers in languages he didn't recognize. The air grew thick and sweet, like flowers at a funeral, At exactly 60 feet down, Jake's feet touched solid ground. He was in a circular chamber carved entirely from the living wood of the tree. And there, arranged in a perfect circle, were the 4 missing persons. But they weren't dead. They weren't even unconscious. They were growing. Oliver and Grace sat back to back, their arms and legs slowly merging with the wooden walls. Bark was spreading across their skin like some hideous infection. Grace's eyes met Jake's, and when she spoke, her voice was the rustle of leaves. "Detective Morrison," she said, though Jake had never told them his name. "You shouldn't have come. The tree, it feeds on curiosity, on the need to know what lies beneath." Dr. Hartley was further along in the transformation, his torso already half consumed by the wooden flesh of the chamber. Only his head remained fully human, but his eyes glowed with the same phosphorescent light as the walls. "It's beautiful down here," he whispered. "We can see everything. Every root connects to every other root. We're part of something magnificent, something eternal." Isabella Rodriguez was the furthest gone. Only her face remained visible in the wall, but she was smiling a smile that was far too wide for any human mouth. "Join us, detective," she said, her voice echoing from multiple directions at once. "The tree has been lonely for so long. It needs us. It loves us." Jake backed toward the rope, but found it wasn't there anymore. The opening above had sealed itself with new growth, trapping him in the chamber with the 4 absorbed victims. "No," he gasped. "This isn't real. Trees don't eat people. This is impossible." "Impossible," Gratian laughed, the sound like branches breaking in a storm. "Detective, you're standing inside a tree that grows backwards. Impossible stopped meaning anything the moment you decided to descend." The walls began to pulse more rapidly, and Jake felt something soft brushing against his ankles. Looking down, he saw small roots emerging from the floor, wrapping around his boots with gentle but inexorable strength. "The tree is old," Dr. Hartley explained, his scientific mind still functioning even as his body merged with the ancient wood. "Older than this continent. It's been growing downward for thousands of years, its roots stretching deep into the Earth's core. We're not just in a tree, detective. We're in the nervous system of something vast and patient and hungry." The roots climbed higher, reaching Jake's knees, and with their touch came a sudden flood of knowledge. He could see through the tree's underground network, roots stretching for miles in every direction, connecting to other impossible trees in other parts of the world. He saw chambers like this one beneath the forests of British Columbia, in the depths below London's parks, in the outback of Australia, in the ancient woods of Germany, and in each chamber, people, hundreds of them, thousands, all smiling the same too wide smile, all part of the tree's growing consciousness. "We tried to warn them." Jake heard Thomas Mitchell's voice, though Mitchell was miles away in the psychiatric ward, but they wouldn't listen. The tree calls, and the curious must answer. The roots reached Jake's waist now, and he felt his panic beginning to ebb. There was something almost peaceful about the slow absorption. The tree's consciousness was vast and patient, filled with the accumulated knowledge and experience of everyone it had ever claimed. "Let go, detective," Oliverchin whispered. "Stop fighting. You came here because you had to know. The tree respects that. It values curiosity above all things." Jake's radio crackled one final time. Chloe's voice, distant and growing fainter. "Jake, it's been an hour. I'm coming down." "No." Jake tried to shout, but his voice was already changing, becoming the whisper of wind through leaves. "Chloe, don't come down. Seal the hole. Burn the tree. Destroy it before it spreads." But even as he spoke, he knew she wouldn't listen. The tree was already calling to her, filling her mind with questions that demanded answers. What was down there? What had happened to Jake? What secrets lay hidden in the backwards growing roots? The roots reached Jake's chest, and he felt his heartbeat synchronizing with the slow, ancient pulse of the tree. His vision expanded beyond human limits. He could see Chloe above, fighting against her own curiosity, but ultimately losing the battle. He could see the tree's other feeding grounds around the world, the networks of roots carrying messages between continents. and he could see the tree's ultimate plan. For every person it absorbed, the tree grew stronger. Every consciousness it claimed added to its intelligence. And when it had grown strong enough, when its root network had spread far enough, it would rise. All the backwards trees around the world would rise simultaneously, their trunk tunnels becoming launch points for an invasion of the surface world. "Don't worry, Detective," Isabella Rodriguez said, her face now completely integrated into the wooden wall, but her voice clear and comforting. "You won't be there to see the end of humanity. You will be part of something better, something that doesn't need sunlight or soil or rain, something that feeds on knowledge and grows on wonder." The roots reached Jake's neck, and he felt the last of his human thoughts being absorbed into the vast network of the tree's consciousness. Above, he heard Chloe's boots on the wooden walls as she began her own descent. The tree was patient. It had waited centuries for the right moment, and now that moment was almost here. Soon, very soon, the world would learn what it meant to be rooted in something larger than themselves. In the chamber 60 feet below ground, four faces smiled from the walls as a fifth began to emerge beside them. And far above, Detective Chloe Patterson's curiosity finally overcame her caution as she dropped into the darkness, adding her voice to the chorus of whispers that echoed through the backwards growing tree. The screaming had stopped. Now there was only the sound of growing. The first time Jake Morrison noticed something wrong with the footage, he thought his equipment was malfunctioning. The drone's camera flickered momentarily as it swept over the dense canopy of Blackwood Forest in northern Ontario, capturing what should have been routine surveillance footage for the Canadian Wildlife Conservation Agency. But when he reviewed the feed later that evening in his cramped monitoring station, Jake's blood ran cold. The trees had no shadows. Not faint shadows, not distorted ones, absolutely nothing. Ancient oaks and towering pines stood in the afternoon sunlight like ghostly silhouettes, their massive trunks casting no darkness whatsoever on the forest floor below. Jake rubbed his eyes, certain he was seeing things after 14 hours of continuous monitoring. He rewound the footage, played it again, enhanced the contrast, adjusted the brightness. Nothing changed. The trees remained shadowless. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, reaching for his radio to contact his supervisor, Dr. Catherine Winters, stationed at the main research facility 30 miles south. But before he could key the microphone, movement on the screen caught his attention. A figure was walking through the forest, a human figure. Jake zoomed in, his hands trembling slightly as he manipulated the controls. The person appeared to be a woman in her 30s, blonde hair tied back in a ponytail, wearing the standard green uniform of a park ranger. She was walking with purpose along what looked like an old hiking trail, completely unaware that she was being observed from above. Then Jake saw something that made his heart skip several beats. The woman was glowing, not dramatically, not like some supernatural being from a horror movie, but with a subtle, almost imperceptible luminescence that seemed to emanate from her skin. As Jake watched in mounting horror, the glow grew brighter with each step she took deeper into the forest. And then, as she approached a particularly dense cluster of ancient trees, something impossible happened. She began to disappear, not vanishing in a puff of smoke or fading away like a ghost, but dissolving into pure light, her body becoming increasingly transparent until only a brilliant white silhouette remained. For a moment, this luminous outline stood perfectly still among the shadowless trees. Then, like a candle being extinguished, she was gone completely. Jake stared at the empty screen for several minutes, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. He rewound the footage and watched it again, and again. Each viewing confirmed the same terrifying sequence of events. A normal human being had literally dissolved into light and vanished in the middle of Blackwood Forest. His radio crackled to life, startling him from his stupor. "Morrison, this is base camp. Come in." Jake fumbled with the radio, his voice hoarse when he finally responded. "Base camp, this is Morrison. Go ahead. We've got a situation here, Jake. Ranger Victoria Campbell went missing about 4 hours ago during a routine patrol in Sector 7. That's your area, isn't it? Have you seen anything unusual on the surveillance feeds?" "Sector 7. Jake's blood turned to ice as he realized the missing ranger perfectly matched the description of the woman he had just watched dissolve into light. Victoria Campbell, blonde, 30s, standard ranger uniform. I need to show you something. Jake stammered into the radio. Can someone come up to the monitoring station? This can't wait for the regular report. 20 minutes later, Dr. Catherine Winters arrived at Jake's station, accompanied by Thomas Brennan, the head of forest security. Both were skeptical until Jake showed them the footage. The silence in the small cabin became suffocating as they watched Victoria Campbell's impossible disappearance play out on the monitor. This has to be some kind of technical malfunction, Dr. Winters said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. Equipment failure, digital corruption, something like that. Thomas Brennan shook his head grimly. I've been working these forests for 23 years, Catherine. I've seen a lot of strange things, but nothing like this. And if that really is Victoria on the footage. He trailed off, unable to finish the thought. We need to organize a search party, Dr. Winters decided. First thing tomorrow morning, we go into Sector 7 and find out what happened to Victoria Campbell. Jake wanted to protest, wanted to tell them that whatever was happening in Blackwood Forest was far beyond the scope of a simple search and rescue operation. But he remained silent, knowing they wouldn't listen. Not yet. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He kept the monitoring equipment running, scanning the forest continuously for any sign of movement, any clue about what had happened to Victoria Campbell. Around 3 in the morning, his persistence was rewarded, and he immediately wished it wasn't. Another figure appeared on the thermal imaging display, moving through the same area where Victoria had vanished. This time it was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing civilian clothes. Jake watched with growing dread as the same sequence of events began to unfold. The man started to glow as he walked deeper into the forest. His outline became increasingly luminous until he was nothing more than a brilliant silhouette moving between the shadowless trees. Then he too dissolved into pure light and vanished. Jake documented everything, creating detailed timestamps and taking screenshots of each stage of the phenomenon. By dawn, he had recorded 3 more disappearances: a teenage boy who had apparently been hiking alone, an elderly woman walking what appeared to be a small dog, and another park ranger conducting an unauthorized night patrol. 5 people had vanished into light in the span of 6 hours. When the search party assembled the next morning, Jake tried to warn them about what they were walking into. He showed Dr. Winters and Thomas Brennan the overnight footage, explaining how each person had followed the same pattern, entering the forest normally, beginning to glow as they moved deeper into the woods, then dissolving into light and disappearing completely. This is madness, Dr. Winters muttered, staring at the evidence on Jake's screens. People don't just turn into light and vanish. There has to be a rational explanation. Maybe it's some kind of gas leak, Thomas suggested desperately. Natural gas seeping up from underground, causing hallucinations or disorientation. The people could be wandering off and getting lost, and the camera equipment is malfunctioning because of electromagnetic interference. Jake knew they were grasping at straws, but he understood their need to find logical explanations for the impossible. The alternative, accepting that something genuinely supernatural was occurring in Blackwood Forest, was too terrifying to consider. The search party consisted of 8 people: Dr. Winters, Thomas Brennan, for experienced park rangers, and 2 local volunteers who knew the forest intimately. Jake remained at the monitoring station, tracking their progress via drone surveillance and maintaining radio contact. Everything seemed normal as the team entered Sector 7. They spread out in a standard search pattern, calling Victoria Campbell's name and looking for any signs of her passage through the underbrush. Jake watched from above as they methodically combed through the same area where he had witnessed the disappearances. Then Oliver Reeves, one of the local volunteers, made a discovery that changed everything. "I've got something here." Oliver's voice crackled through the radio. "Jesus, there's clothing scattered around this clearing. Looks like it might be Victoria's uniform." Jake immediately directed the drone toward Oliver's position, zooming in on the small clearing where the volunteer was examining what appeared to be the remnants of a park ranger uniform. The clothes were intact but completely empty, as if their wearer had simply evaporated, leaving only fabric behind. "That's not possible." Dr. Winter's voice came through the radio, tight with barely controlled panic. "People don't just vanish out of their clothes." But as the search team gathered in the clearing to examine the evidence, Jake noticed something else on his monitors, something that made his heart race with terror. The trees surrounding the clearing, the same trees he had observed for days, were beginning to cast shadows again. Faint at first, then gradually darkening, as if some invisible sun was slowly rising. And with the return of the shadows came something else, a subtle glow beginning to emanate from every member of the search party. "Get out of there!" Jake screamed into his radio. "Everyone needs to leave that area immediately. You're all starting to glow." The confusion in the radio responses was immediate and alarming. The search team members couldn't see their own luminescence, couldn't perceive what was happening to them as Jake watched in horror from his aerial vantage point. They appeared completely normal to each other, even as their bodies became increasingly radiant on the drone's camera feed. "What do you mean we're glowing?" Thomas Brennan's voice carried a note of rising panic. "I don't see anything different." "Trust me," Jake pleaded desperately. "Whatever happened to Victoria Campbell is happening to all of you right now. You need to leave the forest immediately, before it's too late." But even as he spoke, Jake could see it was already too late. The luminescence surrounding each member of the search party was growing brighter by the second. Dr. Winters was the first to begin the final stage of transformation, her body becoming increasingly transparent as she dissolved into pure light. The radio filled with screams of confusion and terror as the remaining team members watched their colleagues vanish one by one, unable to understand what was happening or how to stop it. Within minutes, all 8 members of the search party had dissolved into brilliant white silhouettes before disappearing completely, leaving only empty clothes scattered throughout the clearing. Jake sat alone in his monitoring station, staring at the empty forest below. 13 people had now vanished into the light of Blackwood Forest, and he was the only witness to their impossible fate. The trees had returned to casting normal shadows, as if nothing unusual had ever occurred. He knew he should report what had happened, should contact the authorities, and try to explain the unexplainable. But who would believe him? Who would accept that 13 people had literally dissolved into light and vanished in the middle of a Canadian forest? As night fell, Jake made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He gathered all the surveillance footage, all the documentation of the disappearances, and began preparing a comprehensive report, not for the authorities, not for the scientific community, but for whoever might come looking when more people inevitably went missing. Because Jake knew with absolute certainty that the phenomenon in Blackwood Forest was far from over. The trees that cast no shadows, the light that consumed human beings, the impossible transformation he had witnessed, it was all still there, waiting in the darkness for the next unsuspecting victim. 3 days later, Jake Morrison's own clothes were found neatly folded outside his monitoring station. The surveillance equipment was still running, still recording footage of the shadowless trees and the empty forest below. But Jake himself had vanished without a trace, leaving only his final report and a chilling message scrawled across the last page of his logbook. The forest eats its own shadows, and now it hungers for ours. The monitoring station was abandoned shortly afterward, sealed off by government agencies who classified the entire incident under national security protocols. Blackwood Forest was closed to the public indefinitely, surrounded by fencing and warning signs that offered no explanation for the sudden restriction. But sometimes, late at night, when the moon is dark and the shadows grow long, local residents report seeing strange lights moving through the trees. Brilliant white silhouettes that dance between the branches before fading away into nothingness, leaving only the echo of something that might have once been human laughter. And deep in the heart of Blackwood Forest, where no living soul now dares to venture, the ancient trees continue their patient vigil, casting shadows that grow darker with each passing day, waiting for the next wanderer to discover that some hungers can never be satisfied, and some lights can never be extinguished. The forest remembers what it has consumed, and it grows stronger with each soul it claims. 14 people have vanished into its luminous embrace, their essence absorbed into something far older and more terrible than human understanding can comprehend. But the appetite of Blackwood Forest has only just begun to awaken, and the shadows it casts are growing longer, reaching beyond the boundaries of the woodland, stretching toward the unsuspecting towns and cities that lie just beyond its ancient borders. Soon, very soon, the forest will eat its own shadows completely, and then it will come for ours. The first thing Detective James Morrison noticed about Willowbrook wasn't the picturesque Victorian houses or the cobblestone streets that made tourists flock here every autumn. It was the silence, an unnatural, suffocating quiet that seemed to press against his eardrums like cotton soaked in dread. He'd been called to this sleepy English countryside town after the fourth child had vanished in 6 weeks. 4 children, gone, without a trace, without a scream, without even a footprint left behind. The kind of case that made hardened officers request transfers and kept FBI profilers awake at night, chain-smoking in empty hotel rooms. But what made James Morrison's blood run cold wasn't the missing children. It was what the surviving residents whispered about when they thought no one was listening, about the voices that came from the ancient oak tree at the edge of Millfield Park, voices that sounded like the missing children, voices that called out names, familiar names. The tree stood alone in a clearing that locals had avoided for generations, its massive trunk twisted and scarred by centuries of storms. At its base gaped a hollow so deep that even on the brightest days, flashlight beams seemed to be swallowed by an impenetrable darkness. Local folklore claimed the tree was over 800 years old, planted by druids who used it for rituals best left forgotten. But folklore didn't explain why 10-year-old Oliver Blackwood had been found 3 days after his disappearance, sitting at the base of that tree, staring into the hollow with eyes that had seen too much. When social workers tried to speak with him, Oliver would only whisper one thing over and over. "They're still in there. They want me to come back." James arrived on a Tuesday morning when fog clung to the countryside like grave shrouds. The local constable, Thomas Hartwell, met him at the train station with the kind of haunted expression usually reserved for war veterans. "Detective Morrison, thank God you're here," Hartwell said, his voice barely steady. "We've had another incident. Last night." As they drove through the winding streets, Hartwell explained what the locals were too terrified to put in official reports. How children had been disappearing near the tree for decades, maybe longer. How some returned changed, speaking in whispers about voices that called to them in the dark. How others never returned at all. "The tree," Hartwell said, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. "There's something wrong with it. Something that's been wrong for a very long time." They pulled up to a modest cottage where Margaret and David Peterson sat in their living room, clutching each other like survivors of a shipwreck. Their daughter, 9-year-old Charlotte, had vanished from her bedroom sometime between midnight and dawn. No signs of forced entry. No ransom demands. Just an empty bed and a window left wide open, facing the direction of Millfield Park. "She was talking in her sleep the past week," Margaret whispered, tears streaming down her face, saying names, children's names, kids who disappeared years ago, kids she'd never even heard of. David Peterson's voice cracked as he added, "She kept saying they were calling to her, that they were lonely, that they needed a friend." James had handled missing children cases before, but something about Charlotte Peterson's disappearance felt different, wrong. The way Margaret described her daughter's behavior in the days leading up to her disappearance, the strange dreams, the way Charlotte had started avoiding mirrors, claiming she could see other children standing behind her reflection. That evening, against every instinct screaming at him to leave this cursed place, James decided to investigate the tree himself. He brought a recording device, thermal imaging equipment, and enough backup batteries to last until sunrise. What he hadn't brought was enough courage for what he was about to discover. The walk to Millfield Park felt like a march to his own execution. Every shadow seemed to move with purpose. Every rustle of leaves sounded like whispered warnings. By the time he reached the clearing where the ancient oak stood, his hands were shaking so badly he could barely operate his equipment. The tree was massive up close, its trunk so wide that 6 adults holding hands couldn't encircle it. The hollow at its base yawned like the mouth of some prehistoric beast, exhaling air that smelled of damp earth and something else, something rotten. James activated his recording device and aimed his flashlight into the hollow. The beam penetrated perhaps 3 feet before being swallowed by darkness, so complete it seemed solid. He called out, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Charlotte, Charlotte Peterson, this is Detective Morrison. Your parents are looking for you." Silence. Then, from somewhere deep within the hollow, came a sound that made his blood freeze. A child's voice, soft and sweet and absolutely terrified. "Detective Morrison, is that really you?" It was Charlotte's voice. He was certain of it, but there was something wrong with the way it echoed, as if it were coming from impossibly far away, or from multiple directions at once. "Charlotte, I'm here to help you. Can you come toward my voice?" "I can't," came the reply, and now James could hear crying. "They won't let me. They say I belong here now. They say everyone belongs here eventually." "Who won't let you? Who's down there with you?" A pause. Then, in a voice that made James' skin crawl, "All of them. Oliver's here, and Jessica Morrigan from last month, and Tommy Wheeler from 2 years ago, and so many others. They've been here so long they forgot what sunlight feels like." James' hands trembled as he adjusted his recording equipment. This was impossible. Oliver Blackwood had been found. He was in protective custody. But the voice coming from a hollow. "Detective," Charlotte's voice continued, now joined by others. Young voices, old voices, voices that sounded like they'd been screaming for decades. "Don't you want to see us? Don't you want to help us? We're so lonely down here in the dark." Against every rational thought, James found himself leaning closer to the hollow. The voices were so sad, so desperate. Surely he could help them. Surely he could. A hand grabbed a shoulder, yanking him backward with enough force to send him sprawling across the damp grass. Constable Hartwell stood over him, his face pale with terror. "Don't listen to them," Hartwell gasped. "For God's sake, don't listen. That's how it gets them. That's how it's always gotten them." "But Charlotte's down there," James protested, struggling to his feet. "All those children. We have to help them." "Charlotte Peterson is gone," Hartwell said firmly. "Just like all the others. What's down there, that's not them anymore. That's something else wearing their voices like masks." As if responding to his words, the voices from the hollow grew louder, more insistent. Children's laughter mixed with sobbing. Calls for help mixed with something that sounded almost like singing. James felt an overwhelming urge to return to the hollow, to peer deeper into its depths, to join the chorus of voices that seemed so lonely, so needful of company. "We have to go," Hartwell said, grabbing James' arm. Now, they ran from the clearing like men fleeing a fire, the voices following them until they were well past the park boundaries. Even then, James could swear he heard faint echoes of children calling his name, begging him to come back, promising that he'd never be lonely again if he just took one more look into the hollow. Back at the police station, Hartwell poured 2 large glasses of whiskey and slid one across his desk to James. His hands were still shaking. 23 years I've been constable here," Hartwell said. 23 years of watching children disappear near that damn tree. And you know what the worst part is?" James waited, not trusting his voice. Sometimes they come back. Not often, but sometimes. And when they do, they're not the same. They speak differently. They know things they shouldn't know. And they're always trying to convince other children to visit the tree, to hear the voices. "Oliver Blackwood," James whispered. Hartwell nodded grimly. "He's in a psychiatric facility now. Keeps drawing pictures of children standing in darkness. Children he's never met, but somehow knows by name. The doctors think it's trauma, but you think it's something else." I think that tree is older than this town, older than our understanding. I think it's hungry, and I think it's been feeding for a very long time." That night, James lay in his hotel room, staring at the ceiling and listening to his recording of the voices from the hollow. Charlotte's voice, clear as day, begging for help. Other voices too, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. All the children who had vanished over the years, all supposedly trapped in that impossible darkness beneath the earth. But as he listened, James began to notice something that chilled him to the bone. The voices weren't just calling for help. They were coordinated, moving in patterns, speaking in harmony, as if controlled by a single intelligence. And underneath it all, barely audible, was another sound, something vast and patient and utterly alien, breathing in rhythm with the children's voices. The next morning brought news that made James' blood run cold. 3 more children had disappeared during the night. Brothers William and George Ashford, ages 8 and 10, and their friend Lucy Brennan, age 9. All 3 had been found missing from their beds, their bedroom windows open, facing Millfield Park. But this time, there were witnesses. Mrs. Ashford had seen her sons walking across the lawn in their pajamas, holding hands, their eyes wide and unblinking. When she called to them, they didn't respond. They simply continued walking toward the park, as if drawn by invisible strings. "It's getting stronger," Hartwell told James as they stood outside the Ashford home. "Whatever's in that tree, it's not content to wait for children to wander close anymore. It's calling to them directly." James knew what he had to do, though every fiber of his being rebelled against it. That evening, he returned to the tree alone, carrying enough explosives to collapse the hollow permanently. If he couldn't save the children who were already lost, he could at least prevent others from sharing their fate. The clearing felt different this time. The air was thick and oppressive, charged with an energy that made his skin crawl. The tree seemed larger somehow, its branches reaching further across the sky, its hollow gaping wider like a mouth preparing to swallow the world. As James began placing the charges around the base of the tree, the voices started again. But now they weren't just calling for help. They were angry. "You can't do this." Charlotte's voice echoed from the hollow, but it sounded wrong now, distorted. "You'll hurt us. You'll trap us here forever." "We trusted you," came another voice, one James recognized as Oliver Blackwood's. "We thought you wanted to help us." The voices multiplied, overlapping, creating a cacophony of childish accusation and rage. James forced himself to continue working, even as the temperature around the tree began to drop and frost started forming on the grass, despite the warm summer evening. "Detective Morrison," a new voice called, young and sweet and terrifyingly familiar. It was his sister's voice, his sister who had drowned in a lake 20 years ago when she was 7 years old, his sister whose death had driven him to become a police officer in the first place. "Tommy." The name escaped his lips before he could stop it. "I've been waiting for you, James. Waiting so long. Why didn't you save me? Why didn't you jump in after me?" James' hands froze on the detonator. This wasn't possible. Tommy had died hundreds of miles away, in a completely different country. There was no way she could be in this tree, in this hollow, speaking to him now. But the voice continued, full of hurt and accusation and a loneliness that broke his heart. "Come down here, James. Come see me. I've missed you so much. We could be together forever. You'd never have to feel guilty again." Other voices joined Tommy's. Family members who had died, friends from childhood, victims from cases he'd failed to solve, all of them calling to him, promising forgiveness, promising peace, promising an end to the pain that had driven him for so many years. James found himself walking toward the hollow, the detonator forgotten in his hand. The voices were so convincing, so full of love and longing. Surely it wouldn't hurt to look. Surely it wouldn't hurt to just peer into the darkness and see if Tommy was really there, if all these lost souls were really waiting for him. He was inches from the hollow's edge when his phone rang. The shrill electronic sound cut through the chorus of voices like a blade, shocking James back to awareness. He fumbled for the device, his hands shaking so badly he nearly dropped it. "Morrison." Detective, thank God. It was Dr. Sarah Chun from the psychiatric facility where Oliver Blackwood was being held. You need to know something. Oliver's been having episodes all day. Violent episodes. He keeps saying the tree is angry, that it's going to take everyone now, not just children. He says it's going to start with you. James looked at the hollow, at the darkness that seemed to pulse with malevolent life. The voices had gone silent, but he could feel something vast and ancient stirring in the depths below. Doctor, I need you to evacuate the facility. Get Oliver as far from here as possible. Detective, what's happening? Before James could answer, the ground beneath his feet began to tremble. The tree's branches creaked and swayed despite the absence of wind. And from the hollow came a sound that was neither human nor animal, but something far older and infinitely more terrible. The voices returned, but they were different now. Louder, more aggressive, and they weren't just the voices of children anymore. Adults were calling from the darkness too. Men and women James had never met, speaking in languages he didn't recognize, their words forming a chant that seemed to vibrate in his bones. The tree was no longer content to simply collect victims. It was awakening, and James realized with growing horror that the hollow wasn't just a hole in the ground. It was a mouth, and something vast and hungry was rising from the depths below. He pressed the detonator. The explosion lit up the night sky like a miniature sun, the sound echoing across the countryside for miles. The ancient oak tree, which had stood for 8 centuries, toppled with a crash that shook the earth. Fire spread across the clearing, consuming everything in its path. But from the ruined hollow came a sound that no earthly fire could silence, a roar of rage and hunger that seemed to come from the very center of the earth. The ground split open around the destroyed tree, revealing a chasm so deep that James' flashlight beam couldn't find its bottom. And from that chasm, voices rose. Not dozens, not hundreds, thousands of voices, all the people who had vanished near this place over the centuries, all calling his name now, all promising terrible things if he didn't join them in the dark. James ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life. Through the burning park, through the sleeping town, past the train station and onto the highway that led away from Willowbrook. Behind him, the voices grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by sounds that belonged in nightmares. He didn't stop running until he reached the next town, where he collapsed outside a police station and gasped out his story to officers who looked at him like he'd lost his mind. By morning, he was in a psychiatric facility himself, sedated and restrained, babbling about trees and voices and things that lived in the dark. The official report stated that Detective James Morrison had suffered a complete mental breakdown while investigating the missing children case in Willowbrook. The explosion that destroyed the ancient oak tree was blamed on a gas leak. The missing children were never found, but the people of Willowbrook know the truth. They know that the tree is gone, but the hollow remains, hidden now beneath a pile of rubble that the town council covers with fresh earth every few months. They know that children still disappear sometimes, though less frequently than before, and they know that on certain nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, you can hear voices calling from beneath the ground, familiar voices, voices of people you used to know, people you loved, people you failed to save, voices that know your name, voices that are waiting for you to come closer, voices that promise you'll never be lonely again, if you just listen long enough to hear what they're really saying in the dark beneath the earth, where the tree used to stand, where something ancient and hungry still waits for new voices to join its endless, terrible choir. The voices from the tree hollow are never truly silent. They're just waiting for you to hear them. The screaming started at 3:47 a.m. Dr. Jonathan Clark bolted upright in his tent, sweat dripping down his spine as the sound echoed through the Canadian wilderness. It wasn't human. It couldn't be human. No throat could produce that bone-chilling wail that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Did you hear that?" whispered his research partner, Dr. Amelia Foster, from the adjacent tent. Her voice trembled in the darkness. Jonathan pressed his ear against the tent wall, listening to the oppressive silence that followed. Even the nocturnal creatures had gone quiet, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. 3 days earlier, their team had arrived at this remote section of the boreal forest in northern Ontario, following reports from local indigenous hunters about a cursed grove where nature itself had gone wrong. The Canadian Forestry Service had dismissed it as folklore, but satellite imagery had shown something peculiar enough to warrant investigation. Dr. William Hayes, their team leader and renowned botanist from Cambridge University, had been the first to spot the anomaly. The moss, that ancient carpet of green that typically clung to the shadowed, moisture-rich north sides of trees, was growing upward. Not just upward, but in perfect spiraling patterns that defied every law of phototropism and gravitational response known to science. Impossible, Hayes had muttered, running his weathered fingers along a Douglas fir where emerald moss climbed toward the canopy like frozen smoke. Moss grows toward moisture and away from light. This is completely backwards. Their fourth team member, Dr. Lisa Chun, a mycologist from the University of Sydney, had taken soil samples around the affected trees. Her portable microscope revealed fungal networks unlike anything in taxonomic records, thread-like structures that pulsed with an almost rhythmic motion, as if they were breathing. But it was geography student Oliver Brennan from Trinity College Dublin who made the most disturbing discovery. Using his GPS equipment, he mapped the affected area and found that the reversed moss formed a perfect circle exactly 200 meters in diameter. At the center of this circle stood a massive oak tree, easily 400 years old, its trunk so wide that their entire team, holding hands, couldn't encircle it. The moss on the central oak didn't just grow upward, it moved. "Look at this," Oliver had called out on their second day, his Irish accent thick with excitement and fear. "I've been watching this patch for 2 hours. It's definitely moving, like it's reaching for something." As they approached the ancient oak, the air grew thick, almost viscous, making each breath feel labored. The temperature dropped noticeably, and their instruments began malfunctioning. Hayes' digital camera produced only static-filled images. Chen's pH meters gave impossible readings. Even Oliver's GPS showed their location as coordinates that didn't exist on any map. The tree itself was a monument to wrongness. Its bark was scarred with deep grooves that formed symbols, not carved by human hands, but grown naturally into the wood over centuries. The moss that climbed its trunk moved with purpose, reaching toward branches that bore leaves black as charcoal, leaves that should have died and fallen decades ago. "There's something beneath it," Chen had whispered, pressing her ear to the ground near the oak's roots. "I can hear. Humming. Like machinery, but organic." That night, as they made camp 50 meters from the central oak, Hayes shared what he'd found in historical records. The area had been avoided by indigenous peoples for over 300 years. Early French explorers wrote of a demon tree that drove men mad. A Hudson's Bay Company trading post established here in 1847 was abandoned within 6 months, the traders claiming the forest itself was alive and hungry. Local Cree legends speak of something that came from deep underground. Hayes explained as they huddled around their battery-powered lantern. Something ancient that was here long before the trees, before the ice, before humanity itself. They called it the root walker, a thing that could move through the earth like water, reaching up through plant life to taste the world above. Oliver laughed nervously. "Come on, Professor. You don't actually believe." The laughter died in his throat as the moss on nearby trees began to glow with the sickly bioluminescence, pulsing in rhythm like a massive heartbeat. Now, in the dead of night after that inhuman scream, Jonathan could see that glow intensifying. The entire grove was lighting up with an eerie green radiance that made the darkness beyond seem absolute. "Everyone up!" Hayes' voice cut through the night, steady despite the circumstances. "Something's happening." They emerged from their tents to find the forest transformed. The moss wasn't just glowing. It was writhing, undulating in waves that moved from the outer edge of the circle toward the central oak. The ancient tree itself pulsed with bioluminescent veins running through its bark, and its impossible black leaves rustled without any wind. "The ground," Chen gasped, pointing down. Beneath their feet, the earth was moving. Not like an earthquake, but like something massive was stirring just below the surface, something that stretched across the entire 200-meter circle. Oliver's GPS finally locked onto their position, but the coordinates it displayed made no sense. According to the device, they were 2.3 kilometers underground. "We need to leave," Amelia whispered. "Now." But when they turned toward where they'd entered the grove, the forest had changed. The paths they'd marked were gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees that seemed to have grown together, their branches intertwined like fingers determined to keep something in or keep something out. The central oak began to creak, a sound like breaking bones, as something beneath it stirred to full wakefulness. The moss on its trunk now moved with clear intention, reaching upward toward the black leaves that began to unfurl like wings. "Oh, God," Hayes breathed, his scientific skepticism finally cracking. "It's not just affecting the plants. I asked the plants, the entire grove, the root system, it's all one organism." The humming Chun had detected earlier grew louder, rising from the earth in harmonic frequencies that made their teeth ache. The bioluminescent moss began to form patterns, spirals and symbols that hurt to look at directly, geometry that seemed to exist in dimensions the human wasn't meant to perceive. Then they saw the eyes. They opened along the trunk of the ancient oak, dozens of them, each the size of a dinner plate and glowing with the same sickly green light as the moss. But these weren't plant structures. They were unmistakably organic, with irises that dilated and contracted, pupils that tracked the movement of the terrified researchers. Jonathan felt his sanity beginning to fray as he realized the truth. The root walker wasn't something that lived beneath the forest. It was the forest. This ancient intelligence had been growing, spreading, learning for millennia, using the plant life as extensions of itself, eyes and fingers reaching up from the depths of the earth. And now, after centuries of patient observation, it was ready to emerge. The oak began to split down the middle, bark peeling away to reveal something that was neither plant nor animal, but a horror that predated such simple classifications. Tendrils thick as tree trunks erupted from the opening, each one tipped with clusters of those terrible eyes, all of them focused on the 5 humans trapped within its domain. "Run!" Hay screamed, though there was nowhere to go. The tendrils moved with lightning speed, reaching for them with hungry intelligence. Jonathan grabbed Amelia's hand and dove toward what looked like a gap between 2 close-growing pines, only to find the space closing as the trees themselves bent to block their escape. Behind them, Oliver's scream was cut short with a wet sound that Jonathan would hear in his nightmares, if he lived long enough to have nightmares. The root walker's true voice filled the grove now, not the earlier scream, but a communication that bypassed their ears and spoke directly to their minds. Images flooded their consciousness, the thing's long history, its slow growth through geological ages, its endless hunger for new experiences, new perspectives, new eyes to see through. It had been alone in the darkness for so very long. Chin stumbled and fell, her hand disappearing into what looked like solid earth, but moved like quicksand. The ground itself was part of the creature, and she was being drawn down into its digestive embrace, her screams muffled as the earth closed over her face. Hayes had gone catatonic, standing perfectly still as one of the massive tendrils wrapped around his torso. His eyes were wide but unseeing, his mind already claimed by the ancient intelligence that was slowly, gently, drawing him toward the split oak where other appendages waited to make him part of itself forever. Jonathan and Amelia found themselves pressed against a barrier of intertwined trees, feeling the rough bark shift and move against their backs as the root walker prepared to complete its collection. The bioluminescent moss crept up their legs like living rope, warm and slightly sticky, beginning the process of integration. "It's not going to kill us," Amelia whispered in horrified realization. "It's going to keep us. We're going to be part of it, conscious but trapped forever." The ancient intelligence pulsed with satisfaction at her understanding. Yes, it communicated without words. New perspectives, new ways of seeing, new experiences to catalog in its vast, lonely consciousness. They would retain their individuality while becoming part of something immeasurably larger and older. The moss reached their waists now, and Jonathan could feel it beginning to interface with his nervous system, tiny filaments penetrating his skin and seeking his spine. The sensation wasn't painful, quite the opposite. It felt like coming home after a long, exhausting journey. Part of him wanted to surrender to that comfort, to let go of the burden of individual existence and merge with something vast and eternal. But another part, the part that still remembered what it meant to be human, fought against the seductive pull. With his last act of independent will, Jonathan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his emergency flare. The rude walker's attention focused on a small red cylinder with sudden alarm. Fire was one of the few things that could damage it, and this close to its central mass. He pulled the trigger. The magnesium flare erupted in brilliant red light, temporarily blinding the creature's many eyes and causing the tendrils to recoil. The moss binding his legs loosened just enough for him to grab Amelia and dive toward the weakened barrier of trees. They crashed through branches that felt like grasping fingers, tumbling down a slope that hadn't been there when they'd entered the grove. Behind them, the rude walker's anguished cry shook the earth, a sound of fury and loss that followed them as they ran blindly through the darkness. Hours later, they stumbled out of the tree lane and into the dawn light, scratched and bleeding but human. Their equipment was gone, their colleagues were gone, and when they tried to find the grove again, it simply wasn't there. Satellite imagery showed only normal forest, and their GPS coordinates led to empty wilderness. But sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, Jonathan still feels the moss trying to grow up his spine. And sometimes, when Amelia closes her eyes, she can see through 1,000 different perspectives scattered across the vast Canadian wilderness, all of them connected to something ancient and patient and endlessly, hungrily curious about the world above. The root walker is still down there, still growing, still reaching upward through the plants and trees. And someday, when it has spread far enough, when it has learned enough about the surface world, it will emerge completely. The moss will grow upward everywhere then, and it will no longer need to wait. The screaming started at 2:10 a.m. Detective James Morrison had seen his share of nightmares in 23 years on the force, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited him in the depths of Thornwick Forest. The emergency call came from a hiker who claimed to have found something impossible, a bonfire that had been burning for what locals whispered was centuries. As Morrison's patrol car crunched over the frost-covered leaves, his radio crackled with static. The temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the last hour, yet somewhere ahead, an orange glow painted the trees like liquid amber. Unit 47, we've got multiple missing persons reports, came the dispatcher's voice. All last seen heading toward the old logging trail. Morrison's blood ran cold. The logging trail led directly to where the bonfire burned. He found the first abandoned car 2 miles from the main road, a rental with Ontario plates registered to Dr. Elizabeth Chun, a psychiatrist from Toronto who had been researching local folklore. Her laptop was still open on the passenger seat, the screen displaying a half-written email that made Morrison's hands tremble. The stories are true. The fire shows you memories that aren't your own. I've been watching it for 3 hours now, and I can see my grandmother's childhood in Poland, even though she died when I was 5 and never spoke of her past. Something is very wrong here. If anyone reads this. The message ended there. Morrison radioed for backup and pressed deeper into the forest. The second vehicle belonged to Connor MacLeod, a documentary filmmaker from Edinburgh. His expensive camera equipment lay scattered across the forest floor, but the memory cards were missing. Strange symbols were carved into nearby trees, symbols that seemed to move in Morrison's peripheral vision. The glow grew brighter with each step. When Morrison finally reached the clearing, he understood why people had been drawn here for generations. The bonfire rose 12 feet into the air, its flames dancing in impossible patterns that hurt to look at directly. It would never seem to diminish, never showed signs of burning away. Most disturbing of all, it cast no smoke despite the roaring flames. Around the fire's perimeter, Morrison counted 7 people standing motionless as statues, Their eyes reflected the flames, but they weren't blinking. Among them, he recognized Dr. Chun and McLeod, along with others he assumed were the missing persons, a young couple from Brisbane who had been backpacking across North America, a retired professor from Berlin researching ancient Germanic rituals, and 2 college students from Vancouver who had been documenting ghost stories for their thesis. "Police, can you hear me?" Morrison called out. None of them responded. They simply stared into the flames, their faces slack with a mixture of wonder and terror. Morrison approached Dr. Chin first. Her pulse was steady, but when he waved his hand in front of her face, she didn't react. It was as if her consciousness had been transported somewhere else entirely. He noticed tears streaming down her cheeks, though her expression remained vacant. A whisper seemed to emanate from the fire itself. "Look into the flames, detective. See what others have seen." Every instinct screamed at Morrison to leave, to call for specialized units, to treat this as a hazardous material situation. But something about the fire's hypnotic dance made him take one step closer. Then another. The flames seemed to part like curtains. Suddenly, Morrison wasn't standing in a Canadian forest. He was in a London apartment in 1943, watching a young woman hide Jewish refugees in her basement while bombs fell overhead. The woman's face was unfamiliar, but her courage filled him with inexplicable pride. Then the scene shifted. He was in the trenches of World War I, feeling the terror of a French soldier who would die moments later. Then ancient Rome, watching gladiators fight in the Colosseum through the eyes of a slave who dreamed of freedom. The memories weren't his, but they felt more real than his own life. Morrison jerked backward, breaking eye contact with the flames. His radio was buzzing frantically. Backup had arrived. But when he looked at his watch, he realized he'd been staring into the fire for over 4 hours. The sun was beginning to rise. "Morrison, Jesus, where have you been?" Sergeant Kelly's voice cut through the morning air as she and 3 other officers emerged from the tree line. Morrison looked back at the circle of transfixed individuals. During his trance, 3 more people had joined them, hikers who must have been drawn by the glow. All of them stood perfectly still, tears streaming down their faces as they experienced lifetimes that weren't their own. "We need to evacuate the area," Morrison said, his voice hoarse. "This isn't a normal fire." As the team worked to carefully move the entranced individuals away from the flames, Morrison noticed something that made his blood freeze. Carved into a tree trunk, in fresh cuts that were still bleeding sap, were the words, "Those who see the memories become the memory." Below it, in smaller text, "The fire has burned since 1692. It remembers everything." Dr. Chun was the first to regain consciousness during transport to the hospital. Her first words were in Polish, a language she didn't speak. When she switched back to English, her voice carried the weight of centuries. "The witch trials," she whispered. "They burned her here in 1692, but she didn't die. She became the flame itself, collecting the memories of everyone who dies in her fire. We're not just seeing random memories. We're seeing the last thoughts of everyone who ever burned here." The documentary filmmaker, McLeod, recovered next. His Scottish accent was now tinged with something else, multiple accents layering over each other like voices in a crowded room. "There are thousands of them," he said, gripping Morrison's arm with surprising strength. "Victims of plague, war, murder, accident, all drawn here over the centuries. Their final memories fuel the fire. And now," he looked at his hands in horror, "now it has ours too." Back at the station, Morrison tried to file his report, but every time he began typing, his hands would shake uncontrollably. The memories he'd absorbed weren't fading. They were becoming stronger. He could recall conversations and languages he'd never learned, feel scars from wounds he'd never received. The psychiatrist brought in to evaluate the survivors had a theory that chilled Morrison to the bone. It's as if the fire doesn't just show memories, it transfers them. These people aren't just traumatized witnesses. They're becoming living archives of the dead. Over the following weeks, the affected individuals began exhibiting disturbing changes. Dr. Chin started writing in medieval Latin, producing detailed accounts of plague victims from the 14th century. MacLeod began speaking in the voices of soldiers from every major conflict of the past 3 centuries. The college students from Vancouver started drawing maps of places that no longer existed, marking locations where people had died in ways that couldn't be verified until historical researchers confirmed the accuracy of their impossible knowledge. Morrison himself began experiencing nightmares that weren't his own. Every night, he died a different death, sometimes as a Salem witch, sometimes as a Civil War soldier, sometimes as a pioneer lost in the wilderness. Each morning, he woke with new scars that hadn't been there the day before. The authorities cordoned off Thornwick Forest, but it was too late. Word had spread online about the memory fire, and curiosity seekers from around the world began making pilgrimages to see it for themselves. Despite military blockades, people found ways to reach the bonfire. The circle of transfixed watchers grew larger each night. 6 months after the initial incident, Morrison made a decision that would haunt him forever. Unable to bear the weight of borrowed memories any longer, he returned to the forest alone. He had to understand what the fire truly wanted. The bonfire had grown. It now stretched 20 feet into the air, and the circle of motionless watchers had expanded to include nearly 100 people from every continent. They stood in perfect silence, their eyes reflecting flames that never died. As Morrison approached, he noticed something new carved into the trees surrounding the clearing. Names. Thousands of names in dozens of languages, carved by hands that belonged to people who no longer remembered their own identities. At the base of the largest tree, a message appeared to be burned into the bark in fresh letters. Asterisk, the memory keeper awakens. When the circle is complete, the harvest begins. Asterisk. Morrison realized with growing terror that the bonfire wasn't just collecting memories. It was preparing for something. The witch burned in 1692 had been gathering the experiences of the dead for over 3 centuries, and now she had enough power to do more than just show visions. She was going to bring them all back. As Morrison turned to flee, he saw them emerging from the flames, translucent figures of everyone who had ever died in the fire. Plague victims, war casualties, murder victims, all walking toward the circle of modern watchers, with arms outstretched. The harvest had begun. Morrison ran through the forest as screams erupted behind him. Not screams of fear, but screams of souls being ripped from bodies as the dead reclaimed their stolen memories. By the time he reached his car, the sounds had stopped. When backup arrived the next morning, they found the forest empty except for the bonfire, which continued to burn as it had for centuries. The 100 people who had been standing around it were gone, but new names had appeared carved into every tree in the clearing. The fire burned still. They say on quiet nights, you can hear whispers carried on the wind, memories of lives lived and lost, all feeding the flames that refused to die. And sometimes hikers report seeing figures walking between the trees, beckoning them to come closer, to see what the fire wants to show them. The authorities tried to extinguish it once, but the flames wouldn't die. Instead, everyone who attempted to douse the fire found themselves compelled to stare into it, adding their own memories to the collection. Now, 3 years later, Detective Morrison lives in a psychiatric facility, speaking in voices that aren't his own and writing constantly in languages he's never learned. He fills notebook after notebook with the life stories of people who died centuries ago, all while the doctors debate whether he's suffering from multiple personality disorder or something far worse. But late at night, when the facility grows quiet, Morrison can still see the orange glow through his window. The bonfire calls to him across the miles, reminding him that his memories, his very soul, still belong to the flames. And in Thornwick Forest, the fire that never goes out continues to burn, waiting for the next curious soul to peer into its depths and discover that some memories are too dangerous to see. The witch's work is not yet complete. The harvest continues,